Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this weekend. It was a very busy weekend in regards to news, not only affecting Mexico but affecting the world. And one of the threats, there was various threats this week by the White House, by Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and I would say Donald Trump against Cuba this week, in the middle of threats also against a country like Iran. And I think there was some mention of Canada by President Donald Trump in one of his social media messages. But let's today I'd like to focus on Cuba, since, as you all know, Mexico has had a special relationship with Cuba ever since the revolution took place in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's been a relationship that in many ways has been kind of in the middle, in between the United States. Mexico has been in a very interesting way, has historically used its relationship with Cuba as part of its bilateral relationship with the United States. Well, this week, President Claudia Sheinbaum also came out saying that she would not be sending any more oil to Cuba. So the question mark is what follows now? If we look at that, it appears that there is an enormous economic crisis in Cuba as we speak, and they will no longer be receiving oil from Mexico. And of course, the threats coming from the White House. That's why I really appreciate, once again, Ricardo Pascoe. He's been joining us throughout the years. He is not only an extraordinary political analyst, but he's also was Mexico's former ambassador in Cuba. Ricardo, once again, welcome to the show. So, what could potentially happen in Cuba? I mean, Mexico is no longer sending any oil, and these are continued threats by the White House, by President Donald Trump, that there will be a change in Cuba. Welcome to the show. What's your take?
Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Well, I think that the crucial point in the whole discussion right now is that it seems that the White House and the State Department, uh, now enabled by their apparent victory over Venezuela and the Maduro and the Maduro's regime, uh, have put their eye on Cuba and are devising a strategy that has similar characteristics to what they did in Venezuela. First of all, I think that the White House has defined very clearly that they're not going to send troops to Cuba, so that nobody should be anticipating an invasion and American soldiers in Havana. On the other hand, it seems clear to me as well that they are convinced that Cuba is perhaps a bit like Venezuela, very much living on a precipice in both in economic and social terms,
Mhm.
um, isolated completely from the world economy, now very definitely not receiving any uh, any supplies of gas for their economy and for their electrical system. So at this point, from data that I saw, they're literally days away from not even be able to turn on any generators in the island. Um, so what this means, of course, is that uh, they're truly, truly standing on the abyss. And it seems that the American administration is preparing to help Cuba fall over the abyss, and and therefore have to accept change. I have commented with you on different occasions. There was an agreement between President Obama and President Raul Castro in 2016 that seemed to me like a very favorable agreement for Cuba to begin to open up its economy, to calm the political strains in the island, to liberate political prisoners, etc. Um, But this was rejected finally by the more hardliners within the Cuban Communist Party,
mhm,
headed up, by the way, by Fidel Castro, Raul's brother, who called upon the party to reject what his brother had negotiated
right,
with Obama. But the relevant point about this, apart from just sort of the biblical conflict between Abel and Cain, which is
mhm.
an interesting, subjective but
Right,
interesting uh, part of the whole thing, providing that history has a lot of subjectivity, is
activity.
not only just cold data, but what it shows, Ana Maria, is that the Cuban leadership is divided between people who are willing to dialogue with Washington and those who are not. And I think that standing on the abyss, what the Cuban leadership is going to have to decide is, does it go over the abyss or does it dialogue with Washington? And I think that my suspicion
Mhm,
is that those who are willing to dialogue with Washington are already doing so.
mhm,
And these are, of course, very delicate negotiations, not public. Um, I can't absolutely confirm them, but my intuition tells me that that's what's
mhm,
going on. And I think that, in the not very long future, that is to say, in the next week, couple of weeks, I think that we're going to see some important movement in
mhm,
decisions made by the Cuban leadership to begin to assume the reality, which is that Cuba is no longer viable as a nation under the
mhm.
circumstances that it lives
Right.
in now, and that it's going to have to change. What the terms of that change is
Mhm,
going to be, the terms of Trump and Rubio will be for them, are probably not the more nicer terms that Obama offered them. And it's
mhm.
going to be a difficult decision, but I think that's where we're standing right now, Ana Maria.
Joining us today is Ricardo Pascoe. He's been joining us here and living in Mexico for more than a decade now. I really appreciate you joining us once again. I'm trying to get a sense also, Ricardo, what impact this is going to have on Mexico. I mean, I could, considering how close even the Morena party was, and Morena leadership has been, and the Mexican left has been with the Cuban government. I mean, how, we had the president of Cuba who presided a military parade when President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador was president. I mean, there's a very special relationship between the Cuban government and the Mexican and Moreno as a Morena as a party and the Mexican government. I mean, what potential impact could this have? Could you? I mean, can we anticipate that there's going to be an exodus of Cuban government officials coming to Mexico, military officials? I mean, exodus of Cubans. I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense, what does this look like now that we know that Washington's pressure has been strong, has been very, very strong on Claudia Sheinbaum, so she's no longer sending oil to Cuba at a moment that the that it's most needed.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it depends on what kind of agreement Havana reaches with Washington. One of
Mhm,
the components I would suspect would be some sort of form of amnesty for
mhm,
the leadership in Havana, in the same way that the United States has at least de facto given an amnesty to all the leadership in Venezuela. I mean,
yeah,
that's really what's happened. They don't say it
mhm,
that way, but that's what it means.
mhm,
That there is a sort of an amnesty that's taken place there. So I think that this will be one of the elements that's going to be negotiated. In other words, it's not as my opinion is that there's not going to be sort of this flood of Cuban party, Communist Party leadership flowing into Mexico. Um, I think what it means for Mexico actually is something pretty relevant, which is that Mexico is becoming more and more isolated in Latin America. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
left is being electorally at least, and even militarily. There you have Venezuela, possibly Cuba, um,
Mm-hmm.
completely defeated. And there's a whole turn, as it were, in Latin America toward more conservative, pro-market policies,
Mm-hmm.
more concerned with democratic practices than just one-party systems. And
Mm-hmm.
we see this in Venezuela, we see this in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, in Honduras, um, and the isolation, of course, because of Venezuela and Cuba is just a completely destroyed actor in Latin America at this point. So what this means for Mexico is that Mexico is becoming more and more isolated. And as it become more and more isolated with its policies, these sort of populist, uh,
Mm-hmm.
not anti-capitalist, but certainly not very hostile politics toward democratic practices and market policies, what is happening is that Mexico is becoming weaker and weaker. First of all, and it's the possibility of its negotiation now with the USM MC, whatever it's called, the TEMEC, what we call TEMEC in Mexico, the common market that we have
Oh,
with
USMCA,
America, with
USMCA.
MCA
Yeah.
and Canada, and
Mm-hmm.
that negotiation presents itself much more difficult terms for
Yeah.
Mexico because it's so isolated now in Latin America. It's becoming,
Mm-hmm.
at this point, it's almost the only leftist government in Latin America because although Lula in Brazil is supported by a leftist government, but actually they become very pro market and have a very
Pragmatic, very
and
pragmatic.
and a very open electoral system
Mm-hmm.
in Brazil. Not the way it's happening now in Mexico, that it's all become controlled by one party and the elections are not free any longer,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So um, I see that the effect of the fall of the Cuban regime is going to profoundly demoralize Morena in Mexico and weaken substantially its political clout, both internally and in its negotiations with the United States.
Now, the there's always been this I don't know legend, and but it may I mean legend I think based on truth that Cuba, the relationship between Cuba, the Cuban government and the Mexican government, the Morena government, has been very, very close for a long, long time in supporting Morena in different moments. They even talk about Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador's doctors being Cuban at one point. I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense if something happens which appears there has to be some type of transition within in Cuba, the transition, and I know you gave us some examples what this could look like in Mexico. I'm just even thinking term personally what this could mean for someone like Claudia Sheinbaum and some of the advisors around her. And
Well,
Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, I mean, former president.
yeah, well, they've established very close ties. They have
Mm-hmm.
advisors, uh, both Cuban and of Cuban extraction and Cuban in sympathies all around them, and they play an important role. But you know what? They're completely impotent at this moment, completely impotent. They were the the chief uh, driver that made Claudia export so much oil to Cuba. I mean, it was her Cuban advisors
Mm-hmm.
who convinced her of that. what's happened to them? Where are they now? Now they're
Yeah.
all just impotent because reality sets in at some point, Ana Maria.
Mm-hmm.
And when reality sets in, it is not in Mexico's interest, strategically
Mm-hmm.
speaking, to be sending oil to Cuba. Certainly
Or
not for fiscal reasons for Pemex. I mean, it's a disaster
mm-hmm.
from an
Mm-hmm.
economic point of view
Mm-hmm.
for the state oil company, which is, as
Mm-hmm.
we all know, is just basically bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
But also politically, it's not convenient for Mexico in the context of the need it has to have a very good negotiation with that's coming up between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada in the
Mm-hmm.
next few months. So all of these things tied together have made for a very complicated um, turn in which the Mexican government, or at least Claudia, has made a very pragmatic, not ideological, but pragmatic decision that she has to defend Mexico first, and then think of friends later. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, seeing that she herself must know that the demise of the Cuban Revolution is around the corner, and that therefore it's a lost cause, to put it sort of bluntly in a
Mm-hmm.
horrible way, but it seems to be the case.
And when you say that it's around the corner, do we have any sense it's going to happen this year, the next couple of weeks, the next couple of months? It seems imminent, but
It's very soon.
you
Let's put
know,
it this.
I, it
Let me
just,
put it this way.
yeah.
The gasoline is about to go to finish. There's no gasoline arriving at Cuba. I mean, we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about 20 days that there's going to be no gasoline in Cuba any longer.
Mm-hmm.
After that, what happens? I mean, people stop eating. People can't
Mm-hmm.
move. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing to be done. That's why I say Cuba is standing on the abyss,
Mm-hmm.
and the Cuban leadership has to make the difficult decision of what to do. And I think that what they're going to do is decide that they have to make a deal with the US, and the US will be tough, and the US is going to make difficult demands, and they're
Mm-hmm.
basically going to have to accept a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that there will be it will include some form of amnesty, some form of not face saving, but at least not meaning that everybody is going to be thrown into prison or being shot
Mm-hmm.
the way what they did with the people who were in charge of Cuba when they took over. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, it can't be a bloodbath of vengeance, but there has to be a change, and it's going to be painful and it's going to be difficult, but that's what's coming, and I think fairly soon. No?
Ricardo Pascoe, political analyst. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's Mexico's former ambassador in Cuba. Once again, thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria.